My first task was I assigned myself to find the worst case scenario, to find the one withdrawal rate that could survive or had survived under all historical conditions. When I first did my research, I saw that there were periods of time where investors could successfully take out 6, 7, 8, even 10%. I found that fascinating. I mean, you need to have a healthy percentage of equities in your portfolio to get one of those higher withdrawal rates. In my book, I talked about 55%, but I recently upped that to 65% because it works better almost across the board for all retirees. Every time I went to a more diversified portfolio, it increased the withdrawal rate. The last time I went from 4.5 to 4.7.
You're watching Excess Returns. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler, and we've got a legend with us today. Oh, I've got Justin Carbonneau here, too. He's a legend, too. A legend in and of himself. But who's this? It's not Matt Damon in The Martian, although this guest did go to MIT. And no, it's not Cool Spot, the iconic 7-Up mascot, although he did some time there, too. It's the financial planner's rule of thumb, but never ring finger. His latest book is A Richer Retirement, Supercharging the 4% to Spend More and Enjoy More. Mr. Bill Bengen, welcome to Excess Returns.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, your work precedes you. I think that's a good thing. Let's talk about the original 4% rule. I want to talk about where you were, how old you were, why you incepted this thing. Let's give the history of where this thing came from.
Yeah, it takes me ways back, over 30 years now. At that time, I was a newly minted financial advisor, though not a young one. I was still in my early 40s of my next career. And I started getting clients, and they started asking me questions about retirement, which was about 20 years off for most of them. And I figured, well, can't be hard to find out information about that. And I went through all my CFP textbooks and found nothing about withdrawal rates or how much to save. I went to the library, checked publications, talked to fellow advisors. Nobody seemed to really have a handle on the subject. So I said, maybe just nobody has really taken a look at it. It has been so important up to this point. So I decided to whip out my trusty load of spreadsheets and investigate it for myself.
So as a financial planner, how'd you decide which inputs to put in those original assumptions? Where did those come from?
I just adopted things which I think were reasonable based on what my clients had told me, what they're expecting. A lot of them were saying, I might plan for at least 30 years, so I use that number. Well, my first task was I assigned myself to find the worst case scenario, to find the one withdrawal rate that could survive or had survived under all historical conditions. That turned out to be the unlucky person who retired in October of '68. Just ran into a buzzsaw of multiple big bear markets followed by high inflation, which forced them to increase their withdrawal. Just devastated their portfolio. Something I hope we never see again, at least not during my lifetime.
When it comes to people saying they use the 4% rule now, and we'll get on to how you've updated this because you have updated it. Yeah. What do you think people mean when they say it? What do you think they're missing when they say, I'm using the 4% rule?
Well, I think probably two things. One, they think it means taking 4% out of your portfolio each year, which not. It's more like Social Security, where you take out 4% the first year and then give yourself a cost of living adjustment each year after that. And the other issue is that I think they apply it as a first attempt at what their retirement plan should be. From my perspective, it's probably one of the last things you should look at because there are much higher rates available today.
When did it start to click with you, or was it immediate that those higher rates could be or would be available?
When I first did my research, I saw that there were periods of time where investors could successfully take out 6, 7, 8, even 10%. I found that fascinating. I just, for many years, I couldn't find a theoretical connection between the data and where we want to be. I finally made, about 3-4 years ago, I made a breakthrough where we were able to use inflation and stock market valuation to get access to some of those juicy higher withdrawal rates of the past.
As a planner, did you connect this back to the human side from the get-go? Was this an idea of just how to not screw it up, or did you have? I mean, spending money is hard, right?
Yeah, people need encouragement to do so. It's pretty clear. I think there are folks that are spending, I hear, only their interest and dividends and leave their principal untouched. And I'm sure their heirs are very appreciative of that. But I think if you spend all those years saving money and sacrificing, you should enjoy it.
So let's go back. I want to stick around on the original idea for just a little bit longer. In those periods, 1968 was the failure point. What were some of the other things in the years that you discussed? Actually, just lay out the way the original study was conducted. I think this is underappreciated how you studied this.
Well, I looked at across all historical periods, which, going back to 1926, there's almost 100 years of data. And there are just certain periods of time which stand out. One was 1968, which was, combination factors. Another was 1937. It was like a 50% bear market in 1 year, which is pretty awful. And of course, the 1929-32 situation, which turns out is not the worst case because it was a deflationary period. So investors were actually able to increase their withdrawals, which partly offset their huge losses. It's hard to imagine a bear market like 1929-32, which lasts almost 3 years, and declined stocks by 90%. That's something we haven't seen the parallel of, and I hope we don't anytime soon. 2008, 2009 was bad enough at almost 60%. A lot of people lost, a third of their portfolio value for that. And who knows what the market will bring us in the future.
Can you talk a little bit about the actual 4% itself, what that number represents, what the key assumptions are inside of it, how it can change over time, static, dynamic, all that stuff?
Sure. We start off by assuming that you want a plan for 30 years of withdrawal that you take from a tax advantage account. That's want to have a zero balance in the account at the end. And that your asset allocation is appropriate. I recommend now 65% stocks for most people, 20 or more years planning horizon. And those are some important factors. And the 4% rule works. You take 4%. If you have $1 million, the first year you withdrawal would be 40,000. Then you throw the 4% away completely. And every year, treat it like Social Security does. Give yourself a cost of living adjustment.
Do you think that it seems like in talking to people, a lot of people forget in the original study that you were supposed to throw the 4% away after the first year? Did you run into that a lot? A lot of people confused by that detail?
Yeah, that's something I run into today. There is a legitimate withdrawal scheme where you take 4% of your portfolio every year, but it doesn't work. It doesn't generate as much income as the way I describe it. I use percentages because I want to increase the general applicability of my research. So somebody with $1 million, somebody with $10,000 could use it, equally. Yeah, I just naturally thought in terms of percentages. I didn't have any marketing goals at the time. I was quite frankly just doing that research for my clients, something in-house. And eventually I shared it and the whole hick broke loose.
One of the things that I think you pointed out in the original research was that, and you kind of hit on this earlier, that starting in 1968, two big bear markets in there, plus that inflationary time, that was actually maybe even worse or more painful for investors than those, let's say, if they had invested in 1929 and gone through the Great Depression. So I think that's an important distinction. You can have these huge, massive bear markets, but if that is also coupled with inflation, then, and I think this is kind of the point you're making, and I want to ask about inflation a little bit more in a minute, but that can be even more painful or more devastating.
Yeah, I think of the two, inflation probably the most painful because you're probably stuck with whatever increases you make in your withdrawal rates because of inflation. You're probably not going to encounter any a lot, and not in this monetary environment, a deflationary episode that's just going to knock your expenses down 10% a year. The only way we do that would probably enter another depression. No one, I don't think, wants that.
So when inflation comes, it's kind of sticky. It's here to stay. And before we started this, you were kind of talking about that you're getting these, because of your new book, you're getting these questions from readers. And what I wanted to focus sort of this next set of questions on is a little bit more around like the current environment and what we're faced with as investors today. And one of the questions I guess that I have is, if you look at the overall market valuation, let's say you take something like the CAPE ratio or the Shiller PE ratio, which is elevated given where it's been historically, how do you think about strategies or ways that might take stock valuations into consideration? And also, I guess, the bond yields in terms of like trying to come up with these safe withdrawal rates?
Now, I haven't really examined the effects of bond yields so much because they tend to be fairly stable over time. The volatility is on the equity side of the equation. And determining you need to have a healthy percentage of equities in your portfolio to get one of those higher withdrawal rates. And in my book, I talked about 55%, but I recently upped that to 65% because it works better almost across the board for all retirees and really gives them a lift. Like I was estimating based on market valuations and inflation, using a 55% stock portfolio, the withdrawal rate in today's environment would be about 5.5%. When I go to 65%, that goes up to over 5.8%. So that's a worthwhile increase. And I don't think it's taking much risks to get it.
Yeah, so that's a pretty, like you said, substantial increase from the 4%. So how would you view taking something like the CAPE? And I think one of the pieces of research you've done is looking at market valuations and then looking at different inflationary regimes and trying to kind of embed those in a framework that would allow someone to estimate what that withdrawal rate is. So how would that framework basically be constructed?
Essentially, put inflation first, which is I learned after 25 years of failing to come up with a close number. Once I put inflation first and put stock market valuation second, everything flowed. Stock market valuation is important because if stocks are very expensive, we're probably near a major bear market. And major bear markets around retirement are damaging to your withdrawal rates. Inflation, of course, causes you to increase your withdrawals, which can be even more devastating because they're locked in for the rest of retirement.
One of the, I guess, enhancements here that you are suggesting is the incorporation of, different types of stocks. So mid caps, small caps, maybe even micro caps to get that equity return, higher than maybe what the broader market would give you over time.
Yeah, if you look at my research, I've had 3 different allocations I work with, and every time I went to a more diversified portfolio, it increased the withdrawal rate. The last time I went from 4.5 to 4.7.
One of the things that I was thinking about over the weekend, actually, and I don't know, and it was in relation to this conversation we're having today, but it had to do with, oh, I know what it had to do with. It had to do with, I was thinking of AI and sort of what some of these guys that are, really deep thinkers and that are thinking about AI, but thinking about the developments that artificial intelligence will have, not today on healthcare, but thinking like 10 years from now, like the advancements that are going to be being made in healthcare are, going to be significant and might have a very big impact on longevity. So for people that are maybe 40 and going to be 50 in 10 years or 60 in 20 years, if you make it that far, hopefully, all of us, well, you have, Bill, Matt and I do, that these enhancements with healthcare are just going to be like kind of mind blowing and extending our lives more than we know. And I wonder, like, how do you think about like that a little bit with sort of this withdrawal rate strategy? I mean, I know you have like a 30-year time horizon on this withdrawal rate rule, but do you think about that at all, about how we might be living longer and longer as humans, and so our portfolios are going to need to basically be able to withstand even more time than.
Yeah, even if we're not living longer, there are a certain group of people, the fire folks, financial independence, retire early, we're probably going to have a very long-term retirement because we're going to retire so early. So it's a really valid question. And I've studied the effect on withdrawal rates of increasing the planning horizon. And as you might expect, as you increase the planning horizon, the overall withdrawal rate comes down a bit, but it reaches a floor. For example, under the 4.5% rule, it came down to, well, actually, the current 0.7% comes down to 4.1% for, let's say, 50 or 60 years or longer. And then it doesn't go down any more. So if you want to have 100 years retirement, you're probably still at 4.1%.
One of the counterintuitive things is this U-shaped equity glide path. So, an equity glide path is effectively like the exposure you have to equities over time. And the U-shaped aspect of it is about this idea that you reduce your equity exposure more when you're entering, or I guess before you enter and immediately entering retirement, and then you increase it sort of gradually over time. And, that seems like maybe counterintuitive to a lot of people, because if you're entering retirement and you think, well, I have 20 to 25 more years to live off this portfolio, I need to have my equity exposure maybe highest then. But can you just explain that idea of sort of this U-shaped equity glide path and why it could be important for retirees?
That idea originated with two other advisors, Michael Kitces and Wade Fowle. About 10 years ago, they published a paper and they looked at exactly the issue you're talking about. What happens to withdrawal rates if you increase equity exposure during retirement? And the surprising conclusion I reached was it was of significant benefit to do that, as opposed to having a fixed allocation. And it seems, like you said, counterintuitive. Why does that work? Probably, as they speculated, and I have to agree, it's because if you encounter a major bear market around retirement and you have lower exposure to stocks, you're not going to get hurt as bad. If you have 45% stocks versus 65, and then the bear markets are all temporary. Eventually they run their course and they're over, and then you can just be piling money basically into a market which is going up. So it's a really favorable dynamic it creates.
One of the things, when people think about rebalancing their portfolio, a lot of times investors are like, okay, it's January 1st or it's the beginning of the year, or it's December 31st. I know I got to rebalance back to some, target allocation. But what does your research suggest investors, specifically retirees, do when it comes to rebalancing that's optimal?
My research reveals it's not a huge issue for retirees. You could get away without rebalancing in most cases, but there are a number of cases where rebalancing, let's say once every 12 months, makes a lot of sense. And I think generally that's a fair, mean, middle approach, because it works well under almost all circumstances. It may not be optimal, but sometimes it's hard to judge what to do to get the optimal. You have to do what you can to maintain that.
I wanted to ask you about the permanent portfolio. So the permanent portfolio was developed by somebody, his name was Harry Brown, and it basically is this idea of allocating to 4 very different asset classes. So cash or short-term bonds, long-term bonds, gold, and stocks, with the idea that, you're never really going to lose that much, hopefully, because all those asset classes are kind of performing differently in different economic periods: inflation, deflation, economic expansion, recession. And so you try to get different asset classes that give you diversification across all those different sort of regimes and environments. Yeah. Do you have any sort of thoughts on a diversified allocation like the permanent portfolio and how that could be useful for investors in retirement?
Yeah, in my work, I actually have not done a rigorous test of it in my research, so it's hard for me to give you an authoritative answer. But, obviously there's diversification there in terms of the economic performance of the assets. The only thing I question, 25% gold. Gold is an asset which has had historically much lower return to the stocks. Of course, if they held it the last 2 years, you'd be thrilled because you've done much better than stocks. So to have a permanent allocation in gold, I don't know. I'm holding on to my gold for now, but at some time I'm probably sense that we've reached, the limit like we did in the 80s, and gold dropped, what, 16%, the peak there. So, that can be painful if you have 25% of your portfolio in it.
Let's talk about sequence of returns risk. I know as a planner, this is a big one that I run into all the time. Where you hinted at it earlier, you said 100% stocks right up until 5 or so years out from retirement. What is it about sequence returns risk? How should we think about this?
Well, that applies mainly to retirees because it's been demonstrated that when you get a major bear market around retirement, your withdrawal rate is reduced significantly. So you have to take that into consideration. And, I think people have a natural inclination to pull in their ears a little bit when times get tough. And I don't dispute that. I think that makes sense. It's like a safety valve just in case things really go off the rails. You're not going to be destroyed. The stock market has bear markets, but bear markets are of finite length. They come and they go and they pass, and then you're on for another bull market for 5, 7, 8 years, whatever. So it's easy to overstate, the importance of bear markets on retirement because eventually the market will recover. And if you believe that that is still true for markets, that should bolster your confidence in continuing this withdrawal.
Let's talk a little bit about cash reserves and sort of a bucket strategy, as you've called it. How do you think about that, especially with regards to weathering bear markets?
Sure. Well, I think in effect, my own research incorporates a bucket strategy because it has a 5% cash component in it. It doesn't separate the stocks and bonds. Some people add another, like a intermediate term category. I don't know if that's necessary or not. I haven't read literature that convinces me that that is a viable approach. I think just a simple 2-bucket approach worked pretty well.
We've seen some great work, especially from Wade Fowle, on different types of withdrawal strategies, some of the dynamic withdrawal strategies compared to the fixed inflation adjusted withdrawals. Any thoughts on those? Do you think there's room for all of these things, or?
Yeah, I'm a great admirer of Wade. I think he does some fantastic work, and I read everything he writes. And I think there's a lot to be said for those dynamic strategies, although I haven't really been able to test one. I hope to do that over the next year to see if some gains can be had from adjusting your withdrawals to market conditions during retirement.
What do you think about the idea at the beginning of retirement of front-loading spending, taking more early?
I think that's a viable approach. I analyzed in my book. It fits in with a lot of the attitudes of retirees. They want to spend more when they're younger and maybe less later. For those who use that, it's a viable approach. It's just that you have to be prepared for the magnitude of the clip, the decline, let's say in the 10th year, if you had a decline in expenses in the 10th year, because it could be pretty substantial depending upon how aggressive one was initially in withdrawing. And if you can handle a 25, 30, 35% decline in expenses, and you know what's coming, it should be okay.
In the new book, you've updated the number now to 4.7. I just want to hit it again. Is that strictly because of incorporating the inflation and then stock market valuations, or did anything else play in there?
It's largely because of the change that made in the portfolio. I went from the prior portfolio at 3 asset class, I went to 7 in this asset class. And those extra portfolio elements acted as diversifiers and helped increase the withdrawal rate.
For you yourself, it's 2013 when you started with the 4.5 withdrawal rate for you? Years ago,
Right.
Not long. Congratulations. You've adjusted it at the time. Where are you, to the degree you're comfortable disclosing, where are you at now? How have you updated it? Why?
I have a plan, which I created in 2013. That back then, I did not access higher withdrawal rates, so I started with a 4.5% rate, which was the worst case scenario. And said, let's see how things go. Of course, the stock market has done so well in the intervening dozen years. I find myself really accumulating more cash than is necessary to support my withdrawals. So I've actually increased my withdrawal rate to almost 5% recently, and might do it again. You have to be careful doing that though, because you don't want to let 1 or 2 good years in the stock market convince you that it's all green lights. Because when that bear market comes, it can turn on you pretty nastily.
How many years do you feel like you should have before you start considering a permanent increase in the distribution rate with comfort?
Oh, that's a tough question to answer. I think you have to look at what the causes are. If it's low inflation, and that it looks like low inflation is going to continue, that's a green light to increase withdrawals. If it's because of an exceptionally long bear market exceeded everyone's expectations, you're probably justified after a couple of years increasing withdrawals. That happened to folks in the 1980s who retired just near the start of that huge bear market that ran through 2000, and the valuations on stocks jumped a huge amount, which gave them a tailwind, and they were able to make significant increases in their distributions as retirement went on.
I remember working with a client years and years ago who had done just that and retired in the early 80s with mostly a tax-free bond allocation and a little stock allocation. And they were looking back over, 30 odd years of it and going, now we have more stocks than the bonds.
Yeah.
But as the last, 15% or 15% coupons, finally went away.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's funny. It's easy to feel that way, and because I remember the early 80s was a difficult time for people.
Right.
Inflation was still a big problem. The Fed was fighting it. People weren't sure how successful they'd be. But people like Warren Buffett were saying, hey, I felt like a kid in a candy store. I see all these companies going for 6 or 7 times earnings. I don't even know where to start buying. So, I think he's a good person to watch, quite frankly, in terms of approach to equity allocation.
Probably not a bad person to watch. You wrote in 2020 that retirees can't afford to do buy and hold anymore due to central bank distortions that made huge market swings. What changed your thinking back in 2020? Where'd that quote come from?
Well, I just noticed since the turn of the century, we've had, more large bear markets than you would normally expect in a 20 to 25 year period. And we all know governments around the world have been spending large amounts of money, and their central banks have been reacting by printing money, which is a risk of inflation. So those combination of factors argue for a different approach, in my opinion. We can't expect a relatively stable returns that we used to have until this market clears itself. Till we drop maybe half from where we are now and restart the whole system. The problem is government and central banks are kind of resistant to hit the reset button on that because of the wealth effect. So I don't know if it'll happen. It may be a forced occurrence as a result of default or something, but I wouldn't guess.
So in your book, A Richer Retirement, you have a number of charts and tables, and it's very data driven, which Matt and I can appreciate. But I'm curious, is there like 1 or 2 charts that really stand out to you that are like, this is like kind of the most important thing that you really want? Like if you were to highlight like the top 2 or 3 charts or data sets in the book, like what would you, where do you think you would go with that?
Well, one of the charts would be safe withdrawal rate versus asset allocation, which shows clearly that you need to have a certain minimum exposure to equities. And my preference right now is for at least 65% equities. You get up much higher than that, then you really start running into problems with bear markets. They can devastate you. But that's where I would be now.
Any other charts? Anything else just stand out to you as something that?
Good question. A couple of unexpected charts. I think the rising equity glide path chart is interesting to show how that has superior results to. Although I did that comparison for 55% equities for fixed versus a increasing glide path. When you go to 65% equities, equity increasing glide path is still slightly superior, but is not as much an advantage as it had in 55% equities. So I think we're probably reaching kind of a zone when you get 65, 70% with a rising equity glide path is not much better than a fixed allocation.
One of the things that the book also sort of highlights is you actually are giving people like tools in the sense that they can kind of do this planning themselves. And one of the things that I was just hoping you could talk to is talk about this, talk about the like the selected value of the 8 elements, if I'm capturing that correctly, and sort of what an individual would basically fill out, like the important things. And we've talked about a lot of them, but it's like you have this step-by-step form that someone can use to kind of work through. And maybe it's just this is the strategy, this is the playbook, this is what I'm going to fill out. And so walk us through, starting with the withdrawal scheme and then working down through those elements, if you remember those eight selected elements.
Yeah, the withdrawal scheme is important. That's why I put it first. It's probably the most important thing.
And so the withdrawal scheme is like, just talk to that, like fixed percentage, fixed annuity, front loaded, COLA. Those are the things that you
have.
have
Different ways. In fact, I had a reader suggest something each other day I hadn't even thought of. He says, what if I was to take a fixed 2% COLA each year and not just a COLA based strictly on inflation? And I said, that's really an intriguing idea. So I'll probably run that scenario and put it up on my website for folks to take a look at. But beyond that, you want to take a look at whether to withdraw from a taxable or tax deferred account. Significant difference between the two depending upon the tax rate. You also want to take a look at your asset allocation and also whether or not you want to leave a zero balance, what's called a legacy at the end of that horizon, whatever you're using. And there are a few other factors. Those are what I call the big 5. There are 3 others, which include the timing of the withdrawals, whether you take them early, later, in the middle, whether you rebalance once a year.
As we get sort of toward the end here, just a few more and these are kind of what would you do if. So I guess if you were personally retiring today at age 65 with $1 million portfolio, and your Social Security was enough to cover your basic needs, like what withdrawal rate would you use and how would you kind of allocate the portfolio between stocks and bonds?
Well, you're saying in effect that the portfolio is almost superfluous. It's not required to cover any of their expenses at all, or just a portion of their expenses.
Yeah, I guess let's say Social Security covers the basic needs, so basic stuff, but maybe the portfolio, you need to kind of live off it. You need to be probably using some of it at least to cover other discretionary things like trips and gifts and stuff like that.
Well, what I do is calculate an expense budget. And against that, look at various withdrawal rates and see how to generate a withdrawal plan that matches what my expense is going to be. If that's the case, you should be okay. Even if you take out 3%, I don't think you should take any more risk in your portfolio than you absolutely need to. If you want, you might end up with 40% equities and 35 or something, because the portfolio is so big that it covers so many of the other expenses easily. But if you do that, you also lose the opportunity to build wealth through heirs. So that's a trade-off that you have to remember.
How do required minimum distributions play into this? Because obviously those RMDs have a specific schedule that need to be followed. And like some people, they don't even need to live off the RMDs. They can kind of put that back into the market, like in a taxable account if they don't need it. So I'm just curious, can you just talk to sort of how you think about those in this sort of context?
The RMDs is basically just an artifact of the tax system. From my perspective, it doesn't directly feed into withdrawal strategy. It just happens that the percentage we withdraw in the early years is pretty close to the 4.5%, associated with my rule. But it doesn't generate. If you take a look at the withdrawal rates over time, it goes up very slowly, and probably not keep up with a COLA strategy, which I would recommend. There are times in your retirement where it's okay to be withdrawing 6% or 7 or 8% in later years, but you won't get those kind of rates out of the RMD necessarily.
We have two closing questions, but before we go there, just sort of two questions for you personally. So, do you ever have to pinch yourself that, like, you were interested in this, you were looking for the answer on withdrawal rates and retirement, you did the research and you put this research out to the world, and now you are like kind of I can't tell you how many times, like on this podcast, we've talked about the 4% withdrawal rate, which now we have to update, I think, to the 4.7% withdrawal rate, or, whatever it might be. But, are you ever just like, wow, like I'm amazed that like the world embraced this to the extent that it did?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I feel a little bit like a character monk in a TV show with Tony Techalu, who had this gift for detective work. And whenever people questioned about him, he said, yes, it's a gift and a curse. Because of the sense of responsibility of placed on my shoulders to get my stuff right, because a lot of people will be reading it and acting off it.
Right. No, I appreciate that. And the other thing that I just thought was kind of inspiring, I guess, was in reading, about on your website, which is bengenfs.com, bengenfs.com. And we'll mention that again at the beginning when we do this, Bill. But, there's like a little bio about you and your history and what you were involved in early in your career, and then your shift to financial planning. But I kind of felt like this last little snippet here, I'll read it. If I've learned anything on this journey, you need family, friends, and a passionate interest in something to fully enjoy life. Cultivate all three and they will not fail you. So I don't know. I just thought this journey, the family, the friends, and sort of having a passionate interest, which you clearly have in this research, are, very important to you. And so just, if there's anything you want to say to that, like I'd be interested in it, because I think a lot of people could probably learn from sort of that philosophy.
Yeah, it's a philosophy of life that I evolved over time. And if I was to write that paragraph today, I would probably add health as one of the 4 factors of importance here. If you don't have your health, you really have a problem. As you age and all the other things, you will not be able to enjoy as much as you normally would. But, it's a matter of setting priorities. What's important in life? There are so many phenomena tugging at us for attention. We need to narrow our focus on the things that are really important that will help us create the kind of life we want to live. And that statement was my attempt to summarize what I thought was important.
All right, Bill, based on all of this experience, both in markets and research and helping regular clients, what's one lesson, if you could, that you'd teach the average investor?
Well, I would say that if you're in retirement and you're tracking your plan and you run into a bear market, you're going to find that your withdrawal rate could temporarily increase up to 7, 8, 9, 10%, which could be very worrisome. But they should keep in mind that bear markets come and go, and that if you leave it alone, unless it's a really extremely deep bear market, that you'll probably be okay, and then you'll find a good recovery on the other side will bring your plan back into alignment, target.
Here's to things coming back in alignment once in a while. You've got a new book. Why don't you tell us what it's called? Tell us where to find it.
Sure. It's a Rich Retirement, Supercharging the 4% Rule to Spend More and Enjoy More. You can obtain it on any online bookseller. They all offer it. And I hope people do and enjoy it. I wrote it not largely to inform people, but I also wanted to entertain people to a certain extent. So I tried to use humor in the book. Some people liked it, some people didn't. But I tried not to make it a dry exposition that would bore you to tears.
I'd say you succeeded there. It's important, and just I know from my own professional practice as a planner and from many of the planners that watch this show, and I'll talk to you about this, the household name that you've become in doing this work with a little bit of a sense of humor in there. It's wonderfully humanizing. It's wonderful because it reminds us just how personal finance is.
It really is. There's no one size fits all.
And that's a feature, not a bug.
That's right. That's true.
Bill, we want to thank you so much for coming on Excess Returns.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for tuning into this episode. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe on your favorite audio platform or on YouTube. You can also follow all the podcasts in the Excess Returns Network at excessreturnspod.com. If you have any feedback or questions, you can contact us at excessreturnspod@gmail.com.
No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of the firms of the hosts or their clients.